think in theory, if he hits the play button on the camera, you should be able to see it playing on the computer. Okay. Oh, now I have to know my left from my right? Okay. Great. So, we had a thrilling study of the book of Leviticus last week, which, if you do your year in the Bible plan, most people quit reading at Leviticus. And for the brave few that continue on, they go into the book of Numbers, which is an excellent title for a book because everybody loves math. Numbers actually comes from the Latin out of the Vulgate. It's a very weird translation. It derives from basically the word that gave us the word arithmetic. So be glad that we don't call it the book of arithmetic. The real name is Bamidbar, which means in the wilderness. That's a much better title, and it's actually a lot more about what this book's about. And theologians have broken this book up different ways. Sometimes they study the older generation versus the new generation. I like to look at this book in 5 parts. There's 3 wilderness and 2 road trips. And I like to call this the road trip from heaven. Now, if anybody's ever had kids or been a kid, you might have been on the road trip from, there's a reason I call this a road trip from heaven. And so we start off, we've been at Mount Sinai for about a year, which, again, in our packets, as you notice, that's a different color book. That's a little side story. We get the law. We get most of the law, not all the law. And that's just kind of a side story. So after about a year, God's like, hey, it's time. We're going to go to the promised land. And that sounds really good. It kind of reminds me of like when I was a kid. And, my dad, he worked really hard. He was in a cubicle, worked hard for his money. He's like, we're going to go on a trip to Disneyland or Tombstone. I don't remember. And like 30 minutes into this road trip, my mom's puking from too many donut holes. I'm on a sugar high from the donuts because I don't want the donut holes. My sister's crying. My dad's yelling, I'm going to turn this car around and give you all something to cry about. It was an excellent road trip from not heaven. And I'm sure everybody else can relate that's ever done a car road trip in the 80s. Well, the Bible mimics real life. This is actually worse than any family road trip that has ever happened. Thank you, Taylor. So the way it starts off is in the first 10 chapters, they're sitting at Sinai, and this is where everybody gets kind of bored because we do go through the numbers, the census. And for all you pro-government people out there that's like, you're not getting my numbers, I get it. That turns a lot of people off. But we learn a new literary style of writing. And this is very important, and that's why we're going to look at this from 30,000 feet. We've already talked about chiasms a bit. Now we're going to learn about inclusios. And these are kind of just bookends. And sometimes they can be found really close together, and sometimes they take up a whole book. And Numbers is a good example. We have a census in chapter 1, and we have a census in chapter 2. And so the whole book's about census. No, it's about accountability. And to give you a good example of one of my favorite inclusios, we find it in the book of Matthew. And in, I think it's chapter 2, the angel tells Mary, you will name him Emmanuel, referring to Jesus, meaning God is with us. Now, if we fast forward to the very end into the Great Commission around Matthew 28, Jesus, who we know to be God, says, and lo, I will be with you always. Notice Emmanuel, God is with us, and Jesus, who is God, says, I will be with you. So what's the whole book of Matthew about? What is Matthew writing about? God is with us. That's what an inclusio is. We have 2 bookends that defines what the middle section's about. Numbers is our first introduction to this Hebrewic writing style. And so we have this census where God's getting an accountability of his people. Now, pretty boring stuff until you think about it from their perspective. They were slaves in Israel. They were under a harsh taskmaster. They had no names. They didn't even have a number. hey, 2, hey, 3. They didn't have that. They had make bricks without straw. Now, here's a God who says, take a number. In fact, I want to know your names. Isn't that such a loving God? The difference that they have just gone through, the transformation. As we study this from Genesis up to now Numbers, we're really getting to see the loving side of God where think about that. The earth is but a speck of sand to God. And Jesus tells us that on this speck of sand, God knows when a sparrow falls. And yet, we're more precious to God than a sparrow. And he is now having these people in this census not just count off by a number, but by their name, saying, you are that important to me, and I'm going to deliver you into this land. And we miss this for the boredom that we see in the census. And, this is just like God who says, I know the numbers of the hair on your head. Now, for somebody like me, obviously that's a little bit harder for God. With somebody like Ken, it's a very easy job. Told you I was going to get a joke in there. See, and Taylor was supposed to be on the drums for that one. But he made a joke about my shirt. But my point still stands that this is a loving God. In the census, it does that, and it does something else. It introduces us to the spiritual warfare. And this isn't a hit on modern pastors, so please don't take it this way. But one of the verses we see, and this is right at the opening of Numbers, and this is something that we do need to work into our discipleship. Take a census of the entire Israelite community by their clan and their ancestral families, counting the names of every male one by one. You and Aaron are to register those who are 20 years old or more by their military divisions, everyone who can serve in Israel's army. If we think back to Genesis, God told Abraham for the Amalek's iniquity is not yet complete. Remember, so the Israelites had to go and be slaves for 400 plus years because the Amalek's iniquity is not yet complete. Now, I'm not going to get into all the spiritual divisions that came out of Genesis 6. I told you back then I wasn't going to go down that road. But as Israel, about 600,000 men is the number that we get here in the first chapter of Numbers. It's a little bit more, 608, 550, I think is actually the correct number. They're going to go to war for God. And that's the price that you pay, right? And Jesus said this, if you're going to follow me, pick up your cross. And this is not a hit on pastors, because I know why pastors don't do this on their altar call. Hey, Jesus loves you. Come forward if you want to be saved. And oh, by the way, once you become a Christian, life does not feel good anymore. You're going to be spiritually attacked, and it's not going to be fun. Who wants to come forward? We don't do that. But here's the flip side of the truth. They have God on their side. And that's what Numbers really gets into, is you're going to have a hard time having God on your side, but he's so faithful to his promise that you're going to win. That's the other side. And that's what Jesus was getting at when he says, pick up your cross and follow me. There's an apologist named J. Warner Wallace. He's a former homicide detective. He was an atheist. He says, I'm not a Christian because it's convenient. I'm a Christian because it's true. And I agree with this sentiment. Before I was a Christian, I had, by the worldly standards, I had a big house. My ex-wife, she's a VP for a very large bank. Secularly, doing very, very good. Became a Christian, I'm very, very happy. Two different statements. And it's because we are called to pick up our cross and we go through spiritual battles. Now, the Israelites here are told right from the beginning, this spiritual battle is also going to be a physical battle. You're going to fight like all these ites, the Cushites, the Amalekites, the Hittites, the Jebusites. And there is a spiritual element to why they're fighting them. And, a lot of people have said that God's a moral monster for all the genocide that happens in Joshua. And we'll get to that and we'll cover that answer. But this is the spiritual battle that the followers of God or followers of Christ will enter into. And it's not something that we talk about, but is deeply ingrained in the battle. or in the Bible. And it's just part of the truth. But the other part of the truth is we have God's protection. And Numbers is going to cover that, especially when we get to the end with Balaam and Balak. Now, and again, I'm not bashing on pastors because I know nobody would ever come forward if you're like, hey, become a Christian and get spiritually attacked. Not the best sales pitch out there. So don't take that as a hit on that. I'm just saying that when we do disciple, we also owe it to people to give them the full truth, and which does say, yeah, hey, guess what? You're going to get attacked, but if God is with us, how can we fail? When I went to my commencement, my graduation, the president of my university actually asked a really profound question. If you knew that you could not fail, what would you do for God? And I mean, if you start to think about that, yeah, well, I've got the God that created the whole universe, that was parted the Red Sea, and if I was to go out scared and do something for him, why would I fail, right? And yeah, I'm going to get attacked, but I'm not going to fail. And those are two different statements. And Numbers teaches us that. We also learn that faith and unbelief can both be very contagious from Numbers. So, let's see. Now, as we get into chapter 2, this is something I thought was kind of neat because we always see the Bible hinting forward about stuff. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is sometimes I will reach back to something we've already covered because I think that you can take what you're learning now and see what was already presented. That's called progressive revelation. And sometimes I like to hint forward to things in the Bible because that's what the Bible does. Now, the way God set up this camp, now remember, we talked last week, Eden was holy ground. It was set apart. That's what holy means. But it had boundaries when God created. That's why he was able to kick Adam out. And so the rest of the world was the wilderness, right? And it wasn't holy. It wasn't set apart, and it wasn't clean. And with that idea, we also have this movement that's happening in Numbers. And so God's going to set them up before they move in their camp. And at the center is the tabernacle, which represents Eden with all its Edenic imagery that they built into the tent. And God's right at the center, just like he's supposed to be. Then he sets out the tents. There's 12 tribes, so there's 4 sections, northeast, south, and west, and there's 3 tents on each side. And Numbers doesn't do a good job of explaining this, but this is what I think is interesting. On one side, you have Judah. Then you have another side, you have Ephraim. Another side, you have Reuben. And another side, you have Dan. Now, if you were ever into medieval history, you'd know like knights used to carry their sigil or their banner with like an emblem on it representing their king. Well, so did the tribes of Israel. Judah's a lion. Everybody knows that, right? That's an easy one. Anybody know what Ephraim is? Ox. What about Reuben? He's a man. And Dan? An eagle. Have you ever heard of a lion, an ox, a man, and an eagle put together before? You will when we get to Ezekiel. He has a massive acid trip. And he sees these things. They're not actually angels. They're called seraphims. And there's 4 creatures with 4 faces. What were the 4 faces? Right? These are the guardians of God's throne room. We always talk about the ark with its mercy seat, but we don't focus on the whole throne. And we see that God is setting up this holy land, this set-apart land that's clean. And that's why he tells people, if you're unclean, go outside the camp for 7 days, get clean. It's not a sin to be unclean, because then you can come back into my land. Just like he told Moses, take off your sandals, because you're on holy ground, set-apart ground, because God's presence was there. We're also going to see the same imagery again in Revelation, right? What was guarding the throne of God in Revelations? 4 creatures, one with the face of a man, one with the face of an eagle, one with the face of a lion, and one with the face of an ox. So, again, we see this Edenic kingdom imagery right from the beginning. And so when we're so quick to rush through these, what we call boring books and all the numbers and the repetition, and I get it, we can miss some very profound hints of things to come. Chapter 3, basically, the Levites are given to Aaron to help serve in the tabernacle. He lost 2 sons because they didn't know how to play with fire safely. Chapters 5 through 10, a few more laws. Because remember, Leviticus, kind of a side story. 5 through 10, a little bit more laws. It's basically how the camp is to be pure in God's presence. Now, chapter 6, it's a fun chapter that secular people love to throw in Christians' face. Oh, don't you know the Bible is pro-abortion? If you read it, it doesn't make sense as pro-abortion. You make this magic potion out, dust off the tabernacle floor with some flour and some water. And if a man suspects his wife of adultery, she drinks it. And if she was unfaithful, her thigh shrivels up. Okay, that totally sounds like abortion. Now, here's the thing. First off, if a man's wife was unfaithful, he would know because she was pregnant. That's usually the first indication that she was unfaithful. He'd be like, well, wait a minute, I wasn't there, and you're pregnant. So, probably not going to do the test. A lot of people forget that. Nothing in Numbers 6 says that there's an abortion. People have to read that into the passage. But it's about purity inside the camp, and adulterous relationships inside the camp are not to be tolerated. That's the whole point of that. But we get to the end of the start of chapter 10, and it's time to get on the road, right? And for 3 days, everything goes well, and then the complaining begins. By chapter 11, we see they're just complaining. Now, I want to take us into Psalms because we see, and this is in Proverbs 6, 16 through 19. Anybody have that one memorized just off the top of their head? No? There's 6 things that the Lord hates. No, 7 that are an abomination to him. Haughty eyes, a lying tongue, hands that shed innocent blood, a heart that deceives, wicked plans, feet that make haste to run to evil, and a false witness who breathes out lies. Another translation would be one who sows contempt with their tongue, right? And so what we get from this Proverbs is as soon as they get on the road, these Israelites are just complaining. And in fact, in chapter 11, verse 4, it reads, "Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, and the people of Israel also wept and said, 'Oh, that we had meat to eat.'" Right? They're already complaining. They've been gone from Sinai for 3 days, and they're complaining about the food. They got manna. It tastes like honey. And, it's got everything that they need. God's providing for them, and they're complaining. Now, this verse also gets sometimes gets translated wrong, because the word rabble that's used basically means that person has mixed parents, one that's an Egyptian, one that's an Israelite, right? And I think it's interesting that that's the person that's sowing this discord, that, when I look to the Proverbs, that, there's things that God that sees as an abomination. And I think about the modern church, not the brick building, but the body of believers. And we've got this mixed person that comes into our body, right? It's this person that they're troublemakers. They come into the church, but they hang out with the secular world. God said that you cannot serve 2 masters. They're rabble. They want to, in the world we do it this way, and yet they come into the church. And we already see right here in Numbers, it's not saying that you can't, some people are like, oh, this is obviously against interracial marriage. No, Moses had a Cushite wife. So obviously there's nothing against interracial marriages right off the bat. That's easily disproven. What they're saying about the rabble, there's this thing about cleanness, and I think that there's a very strong tie to serving 2 masters, right? And that's the draw I see with today's Christian body is, if we're going to try to serve 2 masters, the world and God, we become that rabble. You can only serve 1 master. As we go on into Numbers, in chapter 11, 8 through 20, The other thing I see about this is, on this road trip from heaven, I don't know if you guys know this, but in the Old Testament, Yahweh is not referred to as Father. There's 2 verses, I think, where he says that, oh, that I wish I was a father to you, or that you treated me like your father, which makes it just crazy that Jesus shows up on the scene and always calls him Father except for one time. So, that's just mind-blowing right there. But if you ever want to see the Father in Yahweh, you're going to see it right now. Well, there's another time when Moses, Miriam, and Aaron are all acting up. Miriam and Aaron start yelling at Moses, and Yahweh's like, you 3, attend a meeting right now. And then he yells at him. He's like, I talk to Moses face to face. Do what he says. He's the oldest. But you really do see the Father figure right now, because, oh, that we had meat to eat. And so here we go in verse 11, 18 to 20. Who will give us meat to eat? For it was better for us in Egypt. Therefore the Lord will, and the Lord's talking to Moses, therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall not eat just 1 day or 2 days or 5 days or 10 days or 20 days, but a whole month until it comes out your nose and it becomes loathsome to you. Tell me that doesn't sound like a father. Back in the 80s, 90s, you get caught smoking a cigarette by your parents. They're like, oh, you want to smoke cigarettes? You're going to smoke the whole pack. No, you're going to smoke a whole carton. Well, gee, thanks for giving me cancer, Dad. You sure taught me a lesson. But isn't that just such a dad thing? Oh, you want meat? Fine. You're going to eat it till it comes out your nose. Just reminds me, all right, I'm turning this car around. But yeah, they're already complaining. Then we get to chapter 13. They're in Paran, right? And this is sending spies for each of the one tribe. And here's the thing. They come back with fruit. They had evidence of God's blessing, right? Like huge fruit. They're like, here's the evidence. It's awesome. We have evidence. And that just tells us about the human heart today, like with apologetics, something near and dear to my heart. There's so many times people are like, there's just no evidence for God. Well, here's evidence. I reject it. And that just tells you something about the human heart. I was having a discussion the other day, and we were talking about the sower and the seeds. Like, what can apologetics do? Like, can apologetics turn up the hard soil? So, there's still going to be clumps that are hard, but so that seeds can be planted. Will apologetics help to scatter a few of the birds away? Birds will still come and take some seeds. But what is the role of apologetics? And, we just kind of see that here, that with evidence, no matter how much evidence you give somebody, you can't argue them into the kingdom. You can't love them into the kingdom. Again, Paul said this, it's, I plant, Apollos waters. It's the Holy Spirit that grows. And, I think that's something that we need to keep in mind is God does call us to work, but we can't do it without God. And it's just clear here in Numbers. They come back with evidence. And they came to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation of the people of Israel in the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh, and brought back with them into the congregation and showed them the fruit of the land. Caleb and Joshua are the only spies that had faith that God could save them. The other 10 stirred up a mutiny. But chapter 14 does show us that God answers prayers. I don't know if you guys saw that or not. Because in chapter 14:2, all the people of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or that we had died in this wilderness. Right? They start now notice this road trip's just getting worse and worse. We went from just a little bit of complaining about, oh, we want meat, now it's coming out their nose, to, oh, we want to die, this is so bad. Oh, you don't know the pain, it's so bad, I want to die. Right? God goes, okay, sure, your will be done, not mine. That's a bad thing when God says your will be done. Because what does he do? You're going to die out in this wilderness. 40 years. By the way, Moses kind of makes a point in Deuteronomy, right at the beginning. He goes, it's like an 11-day journey, right? Read it. It's like Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 2 or verse 3. He's like, it's an 11-day journey. It took us 38 years and 10 months. Why? Because, that you would let us die. And God went, okay, your will be done. That's the problem. So the generation stayed in the wilderness as justice. They had been rebelling against God. He had been providing them food, and we'll see this in Deuteronomy, but their clothes didn't wear out. What a blessing for the guys. And everybody's like, how's that a blessing for the guys? They didn't have to take their wives' clothes shopping. Honey, I need some new. Nope, looks great to me. But no, their clothes didn't wear out. Like, he took care of every little thing. And they still complained. They still rebelled. And it's not even close to getting as bad as it will get. It gets worse. So, and that's why everybody's like, Numbers is boring. I'm like, well, you haven't read it. Once you get past the census, it gets great. So, how does it get worse? Well, in Korah, the Levites, the very priests that were just set up in the very beginning of this book, they rebel. Right? Hey, you're going to serve Aaron. Okay, we rebel. Right? Like, after God's like, hey, all the old people, the older generation, you're going to stay here for 40 years until you die. Then the Levites are like, we don't like the leadership. We're going to rebel. Well, how's that going to work out for you? It doesn't. You think people would learn their lesson. So they get on their second road trip to leave Paran because there's just no good memories there. And on their second road trip, people are like, we're thirsty. We don't have any water. Moses he's had enough. You want water? I'll give you water. He rebels against God. Now God's leaders are rebelling against him. God's like, well, you can't go into the promised land now. Right? So not only are the people rebelling, but Moses is rebelling. Like, this road trip has gone from bad to worse. And now in 21, this is one of my other favorite stories. The bronze snake, right? We all know this story because it brings forward to Jesus. The Son of Man must be lifted up just like the bronze serpent cursed on the wood. We know all this. And there's a lot of theologians that speculate, why did you have to look? I mean, first off, if you're not familiar, in Numbers 21, verse 5, why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There is no food and no water. We loathe this worthless food. So that's what the Israelites say. So this is how bad the complaining is. There's no food. By the way, we hate this food. I mean, just the hypocrisy at this point. So what does God do? He sends snakes to kill them, right? I mean, just kind of fun. So now they're dying by the snakes, and they're like, Moses, save us. And Moses is like, what do you want me to do? I rebelled against God. But Moses is faithful. He comes back to God. And that's one of the things I love about the Bible. It shows realism. I mean, at one point, here's Moses, the patriarch, Father Moses. You'd think that he has a perfect family. No, him, Aaron, and Miriam get in a fight. That's at Numbers also. Miriam ends up with leprosy and kicked out of the camp for 7 days. I mean, so if you're telling me Numbers is boring, it's not. But she's brought back into the camp after she's made ritually clean through God's grace. Now, so some people have said, look, God's grace doesn't have to make sense. Looking at the snake doesn't make sense. It's all about faith. And a lot of theologians have come up to that point. I think that if you look at just that story without any context, that makes sense. But here's the thing. When we look at this whole story, the Israelites have been rebellious. We go back to Exodus where they're making false calves. There's a lot of fear going on, right? Like they were scared to go into the land when they saw giants. There's fear. What God's making them do is he's making them face their fear. It's not arbitrary to look at a snake and get healed and have blind faith. Nothing in the Bible ever teaches blind faith. In fact, faith is the evidence of things not seen. The Bible teaches clearly faith is based on evidence. God would never say, hey, just arbitrarily look at the snake and just have blind faith in me and I'll heal you. That's not biblically coherent. It's a good theory just based on that verse, But in context, when you look at everything that's happened, God has said, you're a bunch of rebellious cowards. You want my healing? Overcome your fear. Because what does God find as an abominable sin? Cowardice. And that's also in the Bible. And when they overcame their fear, they were healed, right? God is not a God of confusion. That's also in the Bible. He has purpose. And it's when we zoom out, I think that we can better make sense of some of these small biblical stories and why God does what he does. Now, we get to why I call this the road trip from heaven. We get to Balaam. And I want to be clear. Balaam is not a false prophet. A lot of people think he is, but he's not a false prophet. He's not an Israelite, and, he's an evil person. But being evil doesn't mean you can't be a prophet of God. That's crazy. But here's the thing. In chapters 20 through 25, we meet this character Balaam. And it's because this king Balak, he sees the Israelites coming through. He's really scared. He's like, hey, who's a legit prophet that can put a curse on them? Now, let's go back to Genesis 12, right? See how this Bible gets really interconnected. God said, I will bless those who bless you and curse those that curse you. This very language gets used again right here in Numbers with Balaam. And, Balaam tells the messengers, like, hey, I'm going to have to talk to Yahweh. I can only say what he tells me to say. Right there off the bat, it's kind of like, oh, this guy's kind of legit. Because we're going to see with, like, King Ahab, like, he's got, like, 400 false prophets that tell him everything that he wants to say here. But is it Jeroboam or Rehoboam? No, Jeroboam, I think. Who's the southern king is like, hey, don't you have like a real prophet of Yahweh? I want to hear from him. And Ahab's like, I hate that guy. He always tells the truth. And he's like, yeah, you're going to die. He's like, see, I hate him. He tells the truth. Well, Balaam, I can only say what Yahweh tells me to say, right? And so, Balak's not so happy. He's like, I'm going to give you a lot of money. And Yahweh's like, all right, fine, you can go, but you have to say what I tell you to say. And then he's on a donkey, and the donkey's like, nope, you can't go this way. And it turns out God's going to kill him. It's very weird. And God says, I'm going to kill you because you went. Well, you just told me I could go. So that doesn't make sense. And people are like, that's a Bible contradiction. No, it's not, because we find out Balaam's very perverse. And the Bible says that. It's pretty clear that he got permission from God and he was going to try to do some dirty stuff. In fact, we find out later he does do he plays some loopholes, right? And so the angel of the Lord makes it very clear to him, if you don't say what God tells you to say, I'm going to kill you. And he's like, okay, I'll definitely say what God tells. He's a legit prophet. He's seeing the angel of the Lord. He speaks the words of the Lord. What he says comes to pass. He's a legit prophet. He's just not a good guy. That's a very crazy story in the Bible. Plus, there's a talking donkey. It's already getting pretty crazy. And people are like, Numbers is boring. Really? So far, everything I've read in Numbers is anything but boring. And so he finally gets up there, and he goes open his mouth, and he's like, oh, here's a blessing. Goes open his mouth. Oh, here's another blessing. And Balak's like, you're like the worst prophet ever. All right, fine, I'm going to give you one more chance. Just one curse. Oh, here's a blessing. And then finally he gives a messianic prophecy. Talk about not getting your money's worth if you're King Balak. And, this messianic prophecy, they call them oracles, but the oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is open, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty, fallen down on his eyes uncovered. I notice, again, this isn't an oracle from a false prophet. Right from the beginning, this comes off as a very legitimate prophecy. I see him now, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel. It shall crush the forehead of Moab, and break down the son of Seth. Edom shall be disposed. Seir also, his enemies shall be disposed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of the cities. Now, if we went back to Genesis 49:10, when Israel was given his blessings to his 12 sons, and he blesses Judah. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from beneath his feet, until tribute comes to him, and he shall be in the obedience of the people. Right? This is totally a messianic prophecy. Balaam just pronounced Christ's coming and the dominion of the world to Christ. Balak isn't happy. Now, Balaam eventually figures out a loophole and is like, hey, you know what? I can't pronounce curses on the Israelite people, but just through natural means, if we turn them to idolatry, they'll turn against their God because people's hearts are evil. And that's what the Israelites do. Now, these stories have become really popular. In fact, Isaiah 63, Ezekiel 20, Jeremiah 7, Psalm 78, 95, 106, 1 Corinthians 10, Hebrews 4 through 5. They all revolve around these wilderness stories, right? They all come back to this time in the wilderness. And so this book of Numbers, a lot of people think is boring, does play a huge part in theology, but I told you, this is the road trip from heaven. And what we really see here is God's grace. Here is a rebellious people who continues to get more and more rebellious. They're down there. Let me look up the name real quick. I think I wrote that down. They're by the river Jordan in Keboneth Ba, I think is how you say it. Anyhow, complaining, I'm hungry, I don't have water, complaining about something. And here's Balaam paid as a real prophet to curse them. And they've been nothing but horrible to God. And what does God do when they're not even aware? He puts the words in Balaam's mouth to bless them. That's grace. That's the God that we serve. When we treat him like dog dung, he still has our best interests in heart. And I don't say that necessarily as we as Christians, but think about the atheists out there. Think about the secular people that we're like, how could you say that about God? He still has their best interests at heart. God doesn't exist. If Jesus came back to earth, I would kill him again. I'm glad the Jews killed Jesus. And yet, people that were worse than that, God's own people who were rebelling, he was putting the words in Balaam's mouth to protect them without them ever knowing. These same people that spit on God today, God's still out there protecting them. The Bible says God causes it to rain on the just and the unjust alike. We get that. Numbers reaffirms that. That's when John tells us that God is love in 1 John, that's what he's talking about. That's agape love. That's the road trip from heaven. Now, I think I may have missed one of my notes, but I think that's a good spot to end on with how loving our God is. Basically, the book's going to end with the new generation coming up. They're going to fight a couple battles. I think it's Ephraim and Manasseh are like, man, we're good here. They set up a camp. The rest are going to go in, and we're going to pick it up in Deuteronomy where Moses goes, well, dang, I don't get to enter. Let me rehash everything, tell you some wisdom, and good luck. And so that's so far where we're at in the Torah. Do we have any questions? I don't think history always repeats itself, but I think a lot of things do get foreshadowed. And I don't think anything will ever be a surprise with hindsight. Prophecy, I think, is normally always kept vague until it's fulfilled.